Welcome along to today's edition of the show. Unbelievable is the program where we bring you conversations that matter every week. And don't forget, you can find out more and subscribe to our podcast by simply visiting the links in the info below. You can also get the regular newsletter and keep up with the show. We'll even send you a free ebook if you do that. Well, on today's show, we're asking, was Jesus a great moral teacher, or was he perhaps more than that? In his new book, The Godless Gospel, Was Jesus a Great Moral Teacher? Atheist philosopher Julian Baggini says we don't need to believe in the divinity of Jesus to be able to get a good deal of solid secular ethics out of his teaching. My Christian guest, Skye Jethani, is also a fan of Jesus's teachings, and in his new book, What If Jesus Was Serious? A visual guide to the teachings of Jesus we love to ignore, says that Christians need to reconsider the challenge of Jesus's commands and what it means to live life differently in light of them. But as C.S. Lewis famously argued, can an atheist like Julian believe in Jesus as a great moral teacher without also believing the things that he said about himself being the Son of God? Well, really looking forward to today's discussion, gentlemen. Thank you both for being with me. Julian, I found your book actually a very sympathetic and refreshing approach, actually, to the ethics of Jesus. So thank you for it. But obviously, it sounds on the face of it a bit heretical, the Godless Gospel. So tell us where this book came from exactly.
Well, the book doesn't come from any kind of attempt to kind of recreate history or kind of imagine what the historical Jesus really thought. It just strikes me that one of those things I've come across time after time over the years is people saying this thing, that they don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, but they believe he was a great moral teacher. And I just want to say, well, really? Why? What makes you say that? And, a lot of people who say that actually have a very thin understanding of what Jesus actually said anyway. They think, love thy neighbor, that's good. Forgive people, that's good. And so I really wanted to sort of take this seriously. Now, I took it to be the case that we don't have any records for what Jesus said other than in the Gospels. If you believe that Jesus was not the Son of God, you've got to believe that a lot of the stuff in the Gospels is just made up after the event. You can't believe he was just a human being if he performed miracles and claimed to be the Messiah. So the only kind of version of the non-Son of God Jesus we can get, unless we have the deluded non-Son of God, is the moral teachings that you find in the Gospel, and you strip away all the miracles and everything else. And other people, Jefferson did the version of this many, many years ago. He created this so-called Jefferson Bible, in which he took out a lot of the more religious aspects, and Tolstoy did something very similar. So as an exercise, I tried to do that. I basically stripped out everything from the Gospels that would be found objectionable by someone who identified themselves as a non-believer, and saw what was left. And so it's kind of a thought experiment, really, addressed to those people who make that claim. But also I found it also a very interesting kind of thought experiment for believers as well, actually. Because, if you believe Jesus was more than just a great moral teacher, what is it that makes that difference? What is the difference to the teaching? So I think, in a way, for believers to sort of like look at what makes a difference between their version of Jesus and the purely human version of Jesus is quite a nice way for them to shine a light on perhaps what really matters to them as well.
Yes. I mean, just from the introduction that you write in the book, it sounds like you found more than you were expecting to as well when you did delve in, because I think you grew up with a form of Christian faith, but you sort of lost it in your teens, I'm guessing. But you're right. I like this quote. I admit when I started out, I expected his stripped down moral philosophy to consist of little more than a call for charity and forgiveness. But what I actually found is a belief system which goes against the gentle image of Jesus as an advocate of homely moral truths that we can easily and warmly embrace. Much of his teaching is discomforting. Quite a bit is objectionable. Yet this is something even many believers might welcome. So what was the Jesus that you found in terms of the teaching that you were at least willing to look at as an atheist, if not the miracles and so on?
Yeah, indeed. I think a very challenging one. I mean, I think basically he challenges almost all of the sort of values that, particularly in a developed, affluent society, we take for granted, that we think the good life is about, having a comfortable life, an easy life. It's about family as well, which is a big theme, actually. And actually, Jesus teaches quite radical renunciation. I mean, in my view, the key thing, the thing that holds it together seems to be this sense that what really matters, we need to work upon ourselves, to work upon our souls, if you want to use that religious language, to work upon our characters, if you want to use a more secular language. And that's kind of the most important task we have on this earth, to be thee perfect, he says, which is an impossible command. But the fact it's an impossible command is actually doesn't mean it's a meaningless one, actually. I find it quite striking that if you speak to like athletes, artists, musicians, they'll all say happily, I'm always striving for perfection. I never get there, but I'm always striving for it. And that's a kind of the purity of purpose. And we kind of admire that. But when it comes to moral goodness, we think there's something, well, we can't be perfect, so why bother? But he says, no, try to be perfect and work upon yourself. And if you're going to do that, really, everything else is secondary, not just material possessions and wealth, but your blood family. And that's a really big thing, actually, to sort of like claim is secondary. So I think that is a very challenging message.
The bar is very high, if you like, that Jesus sets. And I suppose a question we might want to come to is how can any of us achieve it? And does that leave us in a quandary if we can't? But let me introduce Skye, our other guest on the show today. Skye, I thought this would be interesting to have you on because I knew you'd written this book, What If Jesus Was Serious, on this very topic of whether we do take the teachings of Jesus seriously enough in our Western culture as Christians. And so I invited you on. But before we get to that, perhaps even more significantly, it's been a crazy couple of weeks in the US, where you're from. How have you survived the elections? And tell us a little bit about what life has been like in the last week or two.
I think I've survived by not leaving my home very much. That's the silver lining of the pandemic, I guess. It's been difficult, especially on social media. We are a very, very divided country. I think the outcome of the election, regardless of whether someone is celebrating or lamenting the outcome of the election, everyone agrees that we are a profoundly divided country. And by no means was this election a repudiation of Donald Trump and his way of operating. Over 70 million Americans voted for him, a record number. More voted, obviously, for Joseph Biden. But I think the realities that we've been living under for the last couple of years are not going to magically disappear. The dynamics of American culture, the reality of American politics have taken a significant turn since 2016. And many of us hoped that it would turn back to some kind of normalcy. Maybe it has a little bit, but I think the dynamics are here to stay. And that creates a lot of challenges for all of us, especially those who identify as Christians and with the church.
So where does your book come into all this? Because in a way, as I read the book, it was a challenge to Christian culture, and which very often does, in parts of the world, the US perhaps especially, has seen political power as a means to achieving its ends. And I see from the book that in many ways you see Jesus as speaking directly against that kind of thing.
Yeah, there was actually a moment that happened right around the time my book was released that captured the problem in my mind. I wrote a piece about this for a newspaper here in the US. You're probably aware that Donald Trump marched out of the White House and had the square, Lafayette Square across the street, cleared of protesters with tear gas to have a photo op in front of a church where he held up a Bible, kind of awkwardly pointing to it. And for me, that moment sort of captures what's both wrong with American politics and, frankly, what's wrong with a lot of the American church. And that is, we see the Bible as a token. It's a symbol that we present, but we don't actually open and read it or align our lives or ethics around it. So I think for quite a few American Christians, there is this desire to identify with Jesus, to identify with the Bible, to identify with so-called biblical ideas. But the extent to which Christians in America are actually living or attempting at least to live what Jesus called them to is diminished significantly, and the statistics bear that out. So the challenge is, and this is where I think and why I accepted this invitation today, is what Julian has written, I thought was fascinating and well done. But in a sense, what he's saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that the ethics of Jesus are compelling and we should take them seriously. But from a secular point of view, we don't have to take his identity as divine along with it. And what you see, at least in this side of the pond and much of the American church, is there's a lot of Christians in America who want to take Jesus' identity seriously, that he's divine, that he's the Son of God, he's the Savior of the world, but we don't actually want his teachings. We don't want to be bound by the extremely provocative and important ethical dimensions of what he represents and what he said. So we have this opposite thing going on where one side wants the teachings, but not Jesus the person, other want Jesus the person, but not the teachings. And in my view, you just can't separate the two, and we need to take them together. So that's why this conversation, I think, was very timely.
It just gives, go ahead. Sorry, Julian.
No, Skye, can I come in actually? Because we talk about the presidential election here. One of the president's spiritual advisors, I think, is the official title. I can't remember her. I'm very bad remembering her names, but
is it Paula White by any chance?
That's right. That's Paula White.
Yes.
Yeah. I think she doesn't like the label prosperity gospel, but I mean, a lot of people would say she's part of that. And again, it strikes me as well that it seems to me completely inconsistent with Jesus's teachings that you should promote the accumulation of wealth. And as a result, and I think it's generally speaking, I'm very puzzled. Most people are puzzled as to why it is Trump has such a lot of support from the Christian voters in the US. Is that something that troubles you as well?
Immensely. But I would see Donald Trump's support as a symptom rather than a cause. I don't have all the statistics in front of me, but from what I've read and from various pollsters and organizations, there seems to be a trend with the more biblically literate a Christian is, the more committed they are to their local church, the more they have aligned their life around the scriptures and the teachings of Jesus, the less likely they are to support Donald Trump. So I think what you're seeing is there's forgive the word, but there's a pandemic in the American church of people who view Christianity as a culture or an identity, but it's not really about aligning oneself with the teachings of Jesus. And that's where you see the flourishing of the prosperity gospel and other forms of that are divergent from the teachings of Jesus. And that's where I think much of the support for Donald Trump is to be found. Back in 2015, during the primary season where the Republican Party was trying to pick a candidate from, I think it's 16 or 17 possibilities, the regular church-going evangelical Christians in the U.S. did not vote heavily for Donald Trump. He was very low on their preference list. But once Donald Trump won the nomination, then many of them went there. So it seems to be there's an alignment between a lot of the heretical views that are everywhere in the American church and their alignment with Paula White and Donald Trump. I'm not saying that everything about the Republican Party is contrary to biblical teaching, and I'm not affirming everything in the Democratic Party either, but I think that's what you're seeing going on, is there's just a lot of biblical ignorance, and our churches, frankly, have failed to adequately instruct people in the way of Jesus.
I mean, maybe we could start there in just a moment with that very challenging command of Jesus, to sell all you have, give it to the poor, take up your cross and follow me, as he said to the rich young ruler. Just before we do that, I just want to just close the circle though with your book, Skye. It's not a regular book. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a cartoon book. Let's be clear about this. You've done lots of fun little drawings. I actually love this. It's very well done. But you kind of have developed this particular style recently, haven't you, of doing these sort of drawings?
Yeah, I think I've written 8 or 9 books, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to write more, but I think I finally stumbled on what the book buying audience wants, which are 2-page chapters and a doodle. So it's accessible. Let's put it that way. I've tried to take some of the more dynamic and challenging teachings of Jesus and make them accessible to an audience, and even a younger audience that might enjoy them. But it's certainly not a children's book. I don't want people to think it's...
No, I didn't mean to give that impression. What If Jesus Was Serious is what it's called, a visual guide to the teachings of Jesus we love to ignore. And they do really make you think, actually, those visuals that you've included in the book. As I say, both of your books in that sense are about the teachings of Jesus, but you obviously take a different perspective on whether you can separate the claims he made about himself from his ethical teaching. Now, let's start though with this renunciation of material wealth. You sort of put your finger on this, I think, Julian, in the book, when you talk about the fact that it is extremely difficult for Christians. Lots of Christians don't seem to be obeying what seems to be one of the most obvious commands of Jesus, and something he seemed to show with his own lifestyle as well. You have a friendship with a certain vicar called Brian Mountford, in fact, and I enjoyed the story you told there of him sort of trying to explain how he, as someone living in prosperous West, sort of tries to reconcile that with his own lifestyle. He said it's difficult to choose an ascetic life in modern Britain without being thought something of a misfit, and there's a related sense in which it's helpful for a religious leader to live in the same social category as though he or she serves. And I get that. But I feel the sting of this as well. I look at my life and I think, what would I have said to Jesus if he told me to sell everything I have and give it to the poor? And so do you feel like there's a big mismatch between what Jesus said and what Christians and culture actually do with that teaching, Julian?
I think, frankly, there is. And, we should be understanding it's a difficult message for sure. So it's not surprising that many people don't heed it to the full. But what I think is disturbing, and this disturbed me when I was a Christian in my youth, it was one of the things that first started alarm bells going on my head. It did disturb me just how comfortable people were with their material wealth. It wasn't just that they kind of were trying and they couldn't do it. They actually sort of weren't really very interested in selling their second coat and having just one. They felt it was good enough that they had the fates and the fundraising teas and gave to charity and did good works. But it was a tiny, tiny fraction. And there were some people in the church who were clearly, wealthy even by local standards. So, yeah, and I could not make sense of that then. I really couldn't make sense of it then, and I can't make sense of it now. I think from a secular point of view, though, I think you can make sense of the teaching. I mean, so why should we renounce the world? And actually, what's quite interesting is how much of Jesus's teaching is actually very consonant with other teachings in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, a lot of people think that all these things came out of nowhere and they were completely original. But, the ideal of the ascetic who renounces the world, who focuses on their own purity and goodness, is something you see, for example, in the Stoics. The Stoics had exactly that kind of idea. And it kind of makes sense from a secular point of view, in the sense that even if you don't believe in an afterlife, in the soul, if you only have one life, the idea that living that life true to your highest values is what gives it most meaning and value, does have some kind of power to it. But I think the point there is that, from a secular point of view, perhaps it's easier to make the accommodation. If you do believe Jesus was the Son of God and he was really commanding this, I do find it very hard to understand why so many people are very comfortable in their comfort, if you want to put it that way.
It is a challenge, isn't it, Skye? So how do you do this? Because Julian, you say in the book, I find it extraordinary how many Christians try to dilute this message. Skye, are you about to try and dilute this message at this point?
No, I hope not. I would, if anything, I'd like to root it in a long tradition that Jesus was a part of, dating back to the Torah, right? When Israel's God frees them from slavery in Egypt, there's an interesting dynamic going on here, because on one side, if you recall, the Jews or the Israelites plunder the Egyptians, right? They come out of Egypt slaves, but they have all this wealth with them. And with it, they build this beautiful tabernacle and they eventually settle into the promised land. But the Lord also warns them and says, hey, listen, at some point, you're going to get comfortable. You're going to get wealthy. You're going to have vineyards. You're going to have gold. And when that happens, you will be tempted to leave the Lord your God, to put your trust in that wealth rather than in me. So even going back to the very earliest Jewish texts, there is this warning about wealth as an idolatrous false god in which you put your trust, and you cannot, as Jesus says, serve both God and money. So I think in the broader Jewish context is how you best understand Jesus' words. Now, the debate has always been, when he talks to the rich young ruler, for example, or some others, is this a universal command that applies to everyone? Or is it just this rich young ruler? Of course, Jesus had other followers who were very wealthy, like Joseph of Arimathea, in whose tomb Jesus was buried, was a wealthy man. And Jesus gives different commands to different people. For example, with Peter, he says, leave your nets and come follow me. I'll make you a fisher of men. And yet to the demoniac whom he heals across the sea, who wants to follow Jesus, wants to get in his boat, he says, no, go home and stay with your family. So Jesus offers different calls to different people. And he doesn't universally tell everyone to abandon everything they have and follow him. And so that's where you get into this wiggle room. But I think when you take the broad testimony of Jesus' words, you take the broad testimony of the Jewish scriptures and the New Testament scriptures, there is this undeniable reality of the dangers of wealth and the pursuit of comfort as an affront to faithful Christian living, not just because it's dangerous for our souls and communion with God, but it's also in a way a hindrance to providing for the needs of others. So, and it's an issue that we shy away from way too much in the Western church, because Western society has idolatrized money. And one last story: when I was a pastor at a local church, we began a program to raise money for a building program, and you bring in these outside consultants and you hire all these people and these elaborate sermons and weeks of campaigning. And I asked the senior pastor, like, why are we jumping through all these hoops to raise money when we don't have campaigns like this to teach people how to pray? We don't have campaigns like this to teach people about anything else in our faith. Why do we go through such extensive efforts to get people to give their money? I said, aren't we just admitting that this is an idol and we have to handle it very carefully? And he thought about it for a second, and he said to me, yeah, it is an idol, which is exactly why we have to handle it carefully, because people won't extract themselves from their love of money unless we do it this way. So it's sort of a catch-22.
Yeah.
But I think Julian's absolutely right. This is one of the most central teachings of Scripture that the church presently largely ignores.
I mean, there's one thing I'd say about this, which is interesting as well. I think the message would have been easier to accept in his time. And the reason is this, is that if you were in that kind of first century Palestine, most people, life was very, very precarious and it was very insecure. The greatest wealth you had wasn't really that much. You were dependent upon the land. Famine could. So that sense that the message that you should not seek security in material goods really rang true. I think in the modern Western society, it seems otherwise. The idea that we can gain security through material possessions seems intuitively compelling, right? Yes, because if you've got enough money, you've got the house, you've got the savings, you've got the insurances. In a sense, you are much, much more protected than someone would have been 2,000 years ago. So although it still remains true that can't give you that deep security, that emotional, you might call it spiritual security, it does give you a kind of security, and that's accessible to many more people than it was. So I think the message is really hard to break through in this day and age. So in that sense, that's another reason for being a bit more sympathetic as to why contemporary Christians find this so hard. It's not intuitively plausible in the way that I think it would have been to a lot of people Jesus was teaching.
Do you think that's the case, Skye, that it's harder in a way to internalize that today than it would have been?
I do. And I think that's one of the things that's so jarring for Western Christians when they travel to truly impoverished parts of the world. If I were to lose my job and lose all my income and lose all my savings as a 21st century American, I'm still in one of the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And there is enough of a social safety net that I would have food, I would have clothing, I would have a place to sleep, I would have basic medical care, I would have those things. Whereas if I go to many parts of the world and lost a basic income, I would be destitute. So, and that's where we need, I by no means want to affirm a prosperity gospel point of view, but I do think it's worth noting that 2,000 years of Western civilization and its development, largely driven by many of the ethical teachings of Jesus, have created an environment in which we are not as destitute as we once were. So it's the scriptures do not blatantly diminish wealth as an inherent evil. As I said before, Jesus had wealthy followers. It is about the heart and the character and the virtue of the people and their wealth and what they do with it. As the Proverbs say, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. Because if a righteous person is wealthy and prospering, they're going to use that wealth for the benefit of others, not themselves. And I know this gets twisted into justifying all kinds of materialism. Well, I need to be wealthy so I can help the poor and things like that. But to a degree, there is some truth to the fact that those who have wealth and use it for righteous ends, that's not a bad thing. So I don't think any of us would say that the UK or the US should be as impoverished as the poorest country in sub-Saharan Africa. That's not what Jesus is saying. We ought to be people who wield that wealth with a character that is worthy of it. And that's the central problem.
We'll go to a quick break. Time's already against us, but I'd love to come back to that point you made there, Skye, about the idea that actually, to some extent, it is the teachings of Jesus, the Judeo-Christian heritage of the West, upon which we have built a society in which we value taking care of people and building safety nets and so on. But also this, returning to this question of whether you can divorce the person Jesus from the teachings of Jesus in a sort of secular way. That's our topic today on Unbelievable. The Godless Gospel. Was Jesus a great moral teacher? Was he more than that? My guests are Julian Baggini and Skye Jethani.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion.
Yes.
What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Welcome back to the second part of this week's edition of Unbelievable with me, Justin Briley. Skye Jethani and Julian Baggini are my guests. They've both got books out on the ethical teachings of Jesus. Julian's is called The Godless Gospel. Was Jesus a great moral teacher? Skye's is called What If Jesus Was Serious? It's a visual guide to the teachings of Jesus we love to ignore. And we're asking, can you separate the ethical teachings of Jesus from Jesus, the person who claimed to be Israel's Messiah? Did he in fact claim to be that? Is perhaps another question we could ask in the course of this. And we'll get to those sort of C.S. Lewis type questions around whether you can take Jesus as a great moral teacher without taking his other sayings seriously as well. We will get to that towards the end of today's show. But one thing that struck me as I read your book, Julian, was you kind of say at several points in it that it's remarkable, isn't it, how easily in some respects Jesus's moral teachings can be given a sort of secular way of thinking about them and actually have helpful things to say. And it did just strike me, well, isn't the reason for that simply that we live in a secular society, yes, but which is of course very conditioned by its Judeo-Christian heritage, and therefore the things we value are by nature the things that Christ taught us to value 2,000 years ago. So in that sense, modern secular morality is in a sense inherently Christian. And obviously you've had books by people like Tom Holland recently talking about that, Nick Spencer, who you mention frequently in the book as well. So what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's a massively overstated position, I have to say. I mean, it's obviously just a matter of historical record that Western civilization has been predominantly Christian and therefore has been largely shaped by Christian teaching. Although, of course, you only have to look at what's actually been going on there to realize that a lot of the time that so-called Christian culture was very far from it. If you think, for example, about the Roman Catholic Church, I mean, I was brought up in the Roman Catholic Church in my early years. I mean, if you look at the history of that institution, it's very hard to see a lot of it as anything other than absolutely shameful and awful, actually, the Spanish Inquisition and all sorts of things. So nominally, yes, it's been a very Christian civilization. A lot of the values which have actually held sway over those 2,000 years have been anything but Christian in their authentic sense. But the point is this, that even if it's true that, the story of our origins necessarily have Christian elements, first of all, there are other elements as well. And obviously been hugely influenced by particularly the Greek civilization, the Greek world. I mean, Plato and Aristotle were huge figures, and Plato and Aristotle both had huge impacts on how Christianity developed, actually. I mean, there's a very persuasive argument that the whole idea of the soul as being something immaterial and separate from the body is something that came from Plato and Greek thought. It's not there in the early original Christian texts. I mean, if you read the Gospels, I don't think there's any indication there of disembodied souls, actually, which is why Jesus' resurrection was a embodied one,
a physical one.
Yeah. And Aristotle, of course, was very much taken to be like the almost official philosopher of the Christian church for many, many centuries. So there are lots of other elements as well as Christian anyway. But more importantly is this, which is that if you tell the story of origins, that doesn't tell you where we are now. I mean, you may as well say, that we're just, apes or gorillas or lizards, actually, because we go back that far. If you look at what our culture values and the ethics of our culture, I think the idea that they need Christianity to make sense just doesn't hold up, because actually so many of the values we hold true to and dear to are ones that are found in other non-Christian traditions too. There are many parts of the world which have never been Christian. And there are differences in what they emphasize, for sure, morally, but there are also huge, huge overlaps and commonalities. So I think this is something which is overstated, to be honest. I don't think atheists, secularists should be at all embarrassed about acknowledging the fact that Christianity has helped shape our civilization enormously. Of course it has, but so have many other things. And in a sense, so what? Now we are where we are. The question is, can our ethics stand on its own 2 feet now? The question of what it grew out of is secondary, I think.
Does it make much difference where the ethics came from, Skye, or is it just a case of getting on with it now we've got them?
I think it does matter. I don't disagree entirely with Julian, though. The metaphor that I use is that of a broth. For 2,000 years, the broth of Western civilization has been marinating, with the bone in the broth being the gospel or Christianity or Jesus Christ, however you want to frame that. And for 2,000 years, it has become more and more concentrated. And now essentially secularists are looking at that broth going, wow, this is a very savory, beefy broth. We don't need the bone anymore. Let's throw out the bone, and now we've got the broth. And I think there's a case you could make for that. I understand where that's coming from. Where I think it goes too far is to say, if you had another pot of water and simply let it boil for 2,000 years, it also would become a beefy broth with no bone needed whatsoever. That I would disagree with. I think the contribution of the Judeo-Christian ethics to Western civilization is so integral to what we've become, and exported it oftentimes through nefarious means of colonialism and other things, but nonetheless have exported around the world, you just can't dismiss that. And there are certain things certainly that came from other philosophers, from the Greeks, from the Romans, from Islam, from other sources, but there are other things which are so bizarre to Christianity that to say, well, it's not entirely necessary, I think is an overstatement. And many of them are ones that Julian talks about in his book, the value of humility, the value of honoring those who are poor or who are persecuted, or the bottom of society, essentially. That reversal, it was so foreign, as Tom Holland and others have articulated in their research and historical works. And yet that's so central to the world today, the human dignity of all individuals, individualism itself, which Julian writes about wonderfully in the book. All of those things are so critical to Western civilization and I do think you can throw away the bone and still say that it's here, it's there, we can have it, we don't need this Christian foundation. That's probably true. But I don't think it's as easy to say that this would have developed no matter what in the course of human progression without the need for Christianity or the gospel.
Well, it may be true, but it may be true that it wouldn't have developed that same way without a Christian gospel. I can accept that. Maybe it wouldn't have done. But it still leaves me the question of, what do we want to believe now? Okay. And I think that there are certain things which probably, if you take Christ, let's say Christ out of it, that would be lost. But, as a secularist, maybe those things I'd be happy to lose. I think the things that are of value from that broth, even if they require that history to sort of come about in the first place, they no longer require that. They take on a life of their own. And also, I think the other thing that happens now today is, we live in a world which is highly, highly globalized, and we can now draw on so many other traditions too. And I think even more so today, we see Christianity as just one source among many, many. And, my previous book was about a survey of global philosophy. And there's just so much we can learn from Indian philosophy, from Confucianism, from Taoism, from the oral traditions of African philosophy, and from other first peoples in the Americas and in Australia. So, I think that's where we are now. And as a sect, and of course, if you're Christian, of course that's not going to wash. If you're a Christian, your primary source has to be. But
this is interesting to me because, funnily enough, Skye, your family has Hindu background. I know, and to that extent, I'd be interested in hearing from your perspective whether you feel that culturally Christianity does offer something different than, say, the Hindu background that many of your forebears have had.
Yeah, in fact, my undergraduate degree is in comparative religion, so I affirm entirely the value of studying these other traditions, and where there's congruency and overlap, affirm that. Where there's difference, learn from that. I think that's a valuable thing, even for a Christian to do. And Julian, you're absolutely correct. There are a lot of traditions we can draw from in a globalized society in order to construct a coherent ethical framework, and that also is not a bad project to be involved in. I want to go back, though, to the idea that the values that we affirm them because we have been acclimated to affirm them. The importance of the individual, the value of every life, the dignity of the poor, those things, we resonate with them even as secularists, even as atheists. But the reason we probably do is because of the influence, at least in the West, of Christianity. So and we're getting closer and closer to Lewis's argument here about kind of the moral argument for the existence of God and things like that. That it's entirely possible that we could have evolved into a society in which women are continually degraded, where human dignity is far from central, where the poor are seen as entirely deserving of their negative circumstances, had we adopted a different philosophical or religious system. So in a purely secular atheist framework, it is arbitrary that we have the values we have and that we resonate with them. And I would argue that's not arbitrary. They are central for a reason, and they're discovered in these other religious traditions for the same reason, that there is something intrinsic to our humanness that values these things, and we shouldn't ignore that.
I'm intrigued by the examples you use, though, because for much of the history of Christendom, women have been second-class citizens. There were slaves. The founding fathers of America owned slaves. Racial equality is still not there. So, in fact, a lot of the acceleration towards the affirmation of these values that we've seen have occurred in that period of Western history, which has been a more secularized one. So maybe it's true, the conditions for that to come about maybe required that Christian history. But what's really led to their acceleration has been, well, I don't know exactly, but can it be a coincidence that this acceleration has occurred precisely at the time in which more and more people have been influenced by non-religious ethics?
No, it isn't. I think you're exactly right. But the difference is, I would argue that secularism itself was accelerated by the Protestant Reformation. That it was the importance of individual connection with God, the engagement with the Christian and Jewish scriptures that flourished in Northern and Western Europe during the Reformation, that then led to a renaissance of sorts for knowledge and truth, which then gave rise to secularism. And there's been a lot done on this by various scholars. So secularism is the outgrowth of Protestantism, and I'm sure you've had people on the program, Justin, that have talked about that as well. And most of the greatest reform movements in Western civilization had at their core a Christian ethic, and often were led by the Wilberforces and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s and the Stantons and others who pushed for these things. So I agree with you that secularism is accelerating it, but to argue that secularism came out of nowhere is not true. It came out of a Protestant ethic of individual value and Christian value and Christian virtues.
Sure, but I didn't say it came out of nowhere. I mean, going back to the point where wherever it came out of, the question is, having come out of it, what status does it have now? Does it require, as it were, does the child still require the father to exist in order for the child to exist on its own 2 feet? In the same way that I think that human beings evolved from another species, and now human beings are what they are, and that's wonderful. There is a sense in which the secular
Is it too early to know, really? I mean, in as much as post-Christian society is still a relatively young thing. And I've got other friends who use a different analogy to Skye's broth. They talk about the fruits and the roots, and say we've certainly got the fruits of the Christian revolution, but without the roots, how much longer will the fruits go on? And they have this concern that actually secularism alone cannot sustain these values. You seem to be more optimistic on that front, Julian.
Well, you're right to say that time will tell. There are a couple of things to say about that, though. I mean, if it were to turn out that these values don't have a wide grip on society without a religious underpinning, that may just say something about the weakness of human psychology. It may not show us that these values in any ultimate sense require them. But I think the early signs are encouraging. I think if we look at those societies around the world which I think score highest in terms of generally recognized moral values, where there's greater equality, respect, care for the poor through welfare systems, etc., they tend to be the societies which are actually highly secularized ones. I'm thinking in particular about the Nordic societies, Scandinavian societies, which really, in so many ways model a lot of the values we have, and they're also the most secularized. So I don't think we have yet any evidence to believe that as societies become more secular, they're going to lose that ground. I think the argument that they will is an argument that it's speculation at the moment.
Well, I think. Sure. And we shouldn't probably spend too much time speculating on that. But one quick response, Skye, and then we'll turn to C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, I believe it or not, apart from Indian, I'm also Scandinavian. My mother is Swedish and Norwegian.
You're covering all the bases.
Yeah, I don't know if that makes me Turkish geographically, but there's a point to be made here that he's absolutely correct that these secular societies, particularly the Nordic societies, are ranked astronomically high in various marks of flourishing. As an American, however, what worries me is the United States is a highly diverse society, right, with an enormously complex set of cultures and races and religious traditions. And where I think we get into trouble when we zero in too much on Denmark or Sweden or Norway or Finland is they're more or less homogenous societies. And in those places, I think it's easier to construct a cohesive and harmonious society. But the question is always, how do you get diverse people who don't identify with one another, who see one another initially as enemies or other, to actually love, serve, cooperate with? And that's what the Christian gospel did in the first century in a remarkable way. So you can look at the Nordic countries as an example, but you could also take, the diversity of the Soviet Union or China under communism, an atheistic regime, and see some of the horrors that happened there. So there's a checkered record on all of our traditions, be they Christian or secular. And we can't just cherry pick one and say, see how good it's doing here, and ignore the ones where it's doing poorly. And my hunch is, without a foundational, dare I say it, even religious ethic to bind together a pluralistic society like the United States, it will in time tear itself apart as tribalism and diversity balkanize the society, and there isn't any overriding ethic that drives us closer together.
Thank goodness that's not happening right now, at least, Skye.
Of course not.
No, in all seriousness, let's talk about C.S. Lewis, because I think we have to kind of get to this in this, because one of his most famous quotes, and I'll read it here actually, I think this was in Mere Christianity, and he said, "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." So you're very familiar with this, and you obviously mention it at the beginning of your book, Julian, and I think you anticipate this response from early on. So in a book that is about, was Jesus a great moral teacher, written by an atheist saying, yes, we can take some ethical moral principles from Jesus and forget about the miraculous bits and his claims to divinity. What do you do with C.S. Lewis's argument there?
I first came across that, I think I was a teenager, and I think I was a Christian myself, and some documentary about an evangelical group called the Jesus Army, I think, which is a group in the UK. And they would sort of do training sessions about what do you say to people, because apparently this is something a lot of people said to them. They'd say, hey, you must convert, you must accept Christ as your Lord and Savior. And people say, well, blah, blah. And they'd say, well, look, you've got to make a choice. Are you saying Jesus was a liar, or are you saying he's mad, or what? And they thought this was very powerful. And I remember at the time thinking, this isn't really powerful, is it? Because it is true that the Jesus of the Gospels, the Jesus as portrayed in the full Gospels, not the godless version that I edit, makes these claims. And if you can't take that as a package and say, well, no, he was just exaggerating at those moments. I'm sure he wasn't serious. That is true. But the third possibility is something else, isn't it? The third possibility is that whoever Jesus was, if indeed he was a historical figure, that the things about him being the Son of God and the miracles, everything are things which came to be, added to the myth after his death. As simple as that. Now we can never know if indeed the historical Jesus argued these things or not. But that's what the sense is made of it. So in a way, the dilemma is a kind of, C.S. Lewis doesn't mince his words. He says this is foolish, but the dilemma is a foolish one, because no one who seriously believes this believes that the Jesus they're being asked to accept or reject is the one as historically accurately portrayed in the Gospels. People believe that account is full of embellishments, and therefore they believe there's something behind that which contains some truth, but they don't take the Gospel to be the full story. So
you feel you can leave behind the divine Jesus and still take away some benefit from the teachings of
you can, but in doing that you are discarding a lot of the Gospels. There's no doubt about that.
Yes.
So you're not
and we should make it clear the sort of the second half or final part of the book, at least, that you've written is this so-called Godless Gospel, and you've taken the King James and you've done that Jeffersonian thing, stripped all the divine sayings and claims and miracles out, just left the teaching and said, this is what I would say is the best you can get from Jesus.
That's true. And I think what's interesting is, as an exercise, this is interesting for believers as well, because if you're a believer and you read that, what's missing for you? What is missing for you when you read that? And I think it's a very good question.
Well, I'd like Skye to answer that, because that's the key, I think, potentially here, Skye. What is missing, and what do you make, I suppose, firstly, of Lewis's argument, which obviously Julian says no, doesn't swing it for me.
Well, I think Julian's correct. If you don't take the Gospels as given to us as a coherent unit, then it's certainly acceptable to just take the pieces that you want. And so with Lewis, can you merely take Jesus as a moral teacher? Yes, I think you can. That's not the question. The question is, should you? It's not, can you? Of course you can. I don't think you should. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Unlike Julian, I think it's far more difficult to actually extract what Jesus says about himself from his ethical teachings. I think those are so deeply intertwined, even in the Gospels we have now, that it's not so easy as to say this verse is good moral teaching and the verse following it is about a miracle or Jesus' identity as Son of God, and therefore we can discard that. I mean, even in a verse that he's quoted in our conversation today, be ye perfect, right? Jesus goes on to say, as your Father in heaven is perfect, right? There's another half to that, which is deeply rooted in the Old Testament understanding of the Jewish God. So when you read the Sermon on the Mount, which is what my book is about, or many of Jesus' parables, he talks about the kingdom of God over and over and over again. And as Tom Wright and others on your program have talked about very eloquently, Jesus' ethical teaching is set within the moral framework of the Jewish eschatological expectation of their God coming to reign on earth. And that Jesus himself is bringing that kingdom and is the prophesied Messiah from Jewish scriptures. So you can't just so easily extract this ethic from the kingdom. and the king that he identifies himself as. Beyond that, and I think this is a really important point that Julian makes repeatedly in his book, you say in various places that we can't simply uproot Jesus' moral teachings from its context and replant it in the present day. I think you're absolutely correct. In fact, you critique the prosperity gospel ministers, particularly in America here, who do that, right? They extract a verse from Jesus' teaching, but then they put it into the soil of materialistic, consumeristic modern society and come up with all kinds of bizarre teachings as a result. And I think as much as I enjoyed your book and thought it was brilliant on many fronts, in a strange twist, I think that's sort of what you've done as well, is you've taken Jesus' teachings, you've transplanted them from their original Jewish eschatological framework, and you've planted them into modern secular soil, and therefore come up with this ethical teaching that Jesus' core desire is for us to reach our full self-actualized good. And you bring this up repeatedly in the book, that Jesus' ethical teachings are about personal transformation so that we can become our best selves. And yet that's not what his goal is. His goal is to make people who are fit to inhabit the kingdom of God, which is being inaugurated on earth through him. So that's where I think we get into trouble. We just can't extract Jesus' moral teachings from the telos, or the purpose of those moral teachings, which he's explicit about throughout his teachings.
Julian.
Well, I mean, I think that if we take the gospel accounts as they are written, I think I'd agree with a lot of you say. I think clearly whoever wrote those gospels did have exactly the background that you thought, and they'd framed Christ in this messianic role, and that is true. So if so I don't pretend that what you get when you extract it is an authentic gospel Jesus. So that said, it is kind of a thought experiment. At the same time, though, I think that it's not a straightforward matter of, as it were, extracting it and updating it, because like I said before, actually a lot of what he said finds its echoes in Greco-Roman thought, which certainly doesn't have that monotheistic tradition. There's a book I need to reference, Runa M. Thorsteinsson, Jesus as Philosopher, the Moral Sage in the Synoptic Gospels. Very, very interesting book. And he points out the countless sort of ways in which the teachings of Jesus resonated with non-monotheistic teachings of the time. But I think what I think is missing, but interesting enough, if you do strip out that divinity and everything, is that with Christ, you have the possibility of ultimate redemption and salvation. So if you take the Christ out of Jesus, what you get is a call to be our best selves, to strive, etc., etc. But against the background where ultimately we know life is finite, we often fail, the poor often don't get their reward, and so forth. So you have a much bleaker picture, I think, without Christ as the Savior. And I think that's something that just has to be acknowledged. If you're a secularist, I think that there is, a lot of atheists like to mock what they call happy clappy Christianity, where everything's lovely jumpy. I think there is a version of happy clappy atheism as well, though. Just, don't worry, God doesn't exist. It's fine. Life is joyous. It's wonderful. Well,
as the Atheist Bus campaign said,
yeah, the atheist.
Right.
Stop worrying and enjoy your life.
That's right. So we're from both the UK, and there's this famous post on the side of a bus. It said, "There's probably no God," which was a good start because they said probably, bit of humility there. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. And I think that was so glib. I think that's a real mistake. Things are bleaker if there's nothing to save us, to redeem us. Be the perfect. There is no God to help bridge the gap between our imperfect selves and what we most strive to be. And that's, I think, that's a challenge for the secularist and the atheist to sort of live with that somewhat bleaker outlook.
And I really appreciated that intellectual honesty in your book, that you admit at various points where the teachings of Jesus don't carry the same strength and bite when you take away those dimensions, and that you wrote the book in dialogue clearly with many Christian theologians and leaders and incorporate that in. As far as I'm concerned, as a secularist atheist writer trying to grapple with the teachings of Jesus, you did a brilliant job, and a far more respectful job than others who have just tried to dismiss the teachings of Jesus as ridiculous. In that regard, I think it's good. Again, as I said earlier, you can do that. The question is, should you do that? If you believe Jesus is a brilliant moral teacher on all these different fronts, but the things he claimed about himself or the nature of the world or the nature of God are ridiculous and should be dismissed, that's where I think it gets a little bit more in line with what Lewis said, which is you can't cherry pick this and not that, especially when they are so deeply interwoven together in these documents that we call the four Gospels. So if anything, I would encourage somebody, if they really don't want all those other aspects of Jesus, then bypass him and go to those Greek sources and go to those other traditions where you don't have those Jewish entanglements with Messiah and the kingdom of God and all those things, and construct your ethics there. But if you're going to go to Jesus as the main source for your ethical understanding and vision of life in the world, then it only really makes coherent sense if you also take his vision of reality along with the ethics as a package.
Can I just call this to a halt? We're going to come back to this for just 10 minutes more conversation after a quick break. I hate to break in, but fantastic conversation you guys are having. Really, really enjoying being the fly on the wall for this one. It's Justin Briley with Skye Jethani and Julian Baggini. We're talking about the moral teachings of Jesus. And was he just a moral teacher, or was he something more? That's our subject on today's edition of Unbelievable. We'll be back in a short moment.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Welcome back to the final part of today's discussion. Let me encourage you to go and find the books of my guests today, Julian Baggini and Skye Jethani. Again, just a reminder that those are The Godless Gospel by Julian, Was Jesus a Great Moral Teacher? And Skye Jethani's book, What If Jesus Was Serious? A Visual Guide to the Teachings of Jesus We Love to Ignore. Links from today's show, you can find out more there. Really did enjoy both of these books. I think what you've written is actually a very sympathetic and gracious account of how, as an atheist, you come to try and get the best as you can from Jesus's teachings. But yes, I mean, Skye sort of ended up saying there, why not just bypass Jesus and the complexities and just go with the Greeks and the philosophers? What's your answer to that then?
Well, it's very interesting. One thing that struck me, as Skye said, I spoke to a lot of Christian theologians for the book because I wanted to sort of be fair and check I wasn't getting things wrong. And what surprised me in a way was they pretty much all said, look, you don't actually get a complete moral teaching from Jesus. Jesus is about many things. The moral teaching is just part of it. And, you need the whole kind of background of his tradition to make sense of it. But one of them said something I thought was really very insightful. She had this sort of metaphor. Karen Kirby, who's a British theologian, she sort of said, no, I tell her, she may not be British. She's British based.
Okay.
She was saying that the metaphor she uses is Jesus is teaching, it's like the leaven in a bread. The bread's made up mainly of water and flour, but the yeast is what gives it life, puffs it out, enables it to grow. And she sort of compared Jesus's moral teachings, this kind of leaven. It was implanted into that tradition of the Jewish tradition, and from within that kind of made it much more than it could be. But I think that the leaven can also be transplanted into other kind of breads as well. So I agree. So I retain my primary sources of my moral philosophy remain people like Aristotle and Hume. But as this kind of leavening agent, as this kind of like challenger, this thing which sort of like pushes things a bit further, that's how I find Jesus valuable, not as the source of my moral vision.
Yes, and I suppose the question I had was, why has morality essentially been based on the teachings of Jesus rather than Aristotle and Plato and others to some extent? Given that he was not a famous philosopher in Greece, he was really nobody to some degree, and yet we regard his teaching as almost that of a genius. Now, I suppose my cheeky question as we start to conclude is, if he was, isn't it remarkable that someone that I think ultimately think was sort of a failed apocalyptic prophet, Julian, nonetheless gave us this body of teaching which has revolutionized the West, arguably. And does that not suggest something's going on here that suggests Jesus was, if not just a great moral teacher, certainly more than just a failed apocalyptic prophet, you know?
I think it's a very big question you ask, and on your bookshelf behind you, I see you have the Revolutionary volume edited by Tom Holland, which
you appear in. There
exactly.
You go.
And I think what I kind of argued there was that, I think one of the things that has enabled Christianity to be so enduring was, in a sense, there's a lot of ambiguity and room for interpretation. And what's actually happened is, what's made Christianity so powerful, it's only sort of tenuously connected with what Jesus says in the gospel, actually. I mean, if it weren't for the Roman Empire sort of like becoming Christian and, imposing a version of Christianity, which I don't think is very authentic to the gospels, then maybe we wouldn't have had that power. So there's a lot of politics and there's a lot of interpretation. And as I said earlier, actually a lot of the kind of teachings in Christendom over the millennia just simply haven't been very Christian. So I think you explain the endurance of Christianity and the growth of Christianity. You can explain that in ways which don't have to attribute a sort of incredible power to the teaching. But nevertheless, there are incredibly powerful things there, for sure.
Skye, any final thoughts as we start to draw the program to a close?
I want to affirm Julian. I think he's correct. When you read the Gospels, the vast majority of the writings are not ethical teachings. Jesus doesn't lay out a coherent, complete system for life. That's not what those texts are for. Far more of the texts are spent detailing, frankly, the last week of his earthly life and his journey to the cross. So, and even Jesus admits this in John's gospel, for example, toward the end. He says, there's many other things I would like to teach you. I don't have time, which is why my Holy Spirit is going to come and will lead you into all truth. And then you get the rest of the New Testament, which is the story of his followers and the earliest churches trying to operationalize this eschatological vision of the kingdom of God as a reality here on earth. And they face all kinds of ethical dilemmas that Jesus never talked about. What do we do about Gentiles? What about circumcision? What do we do about the guy who's sleeping with his father's wife? All this crazy stuff going on in these, and they have to work it out. But it's with the eschatological understanding that Jesus is still alive and present because of the resurrection. And Julian mentions this even in his book, that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, that if Jesus is not risen from the dead, then we're to be pitied, because there's then no coherent world vision or view in which these ethical teachings make real sense. And as to the endurance of the church and the expansion of Christianity throughout the world, again, I want to affirm what Julian said. I think that idea of the leaven, unlike Islam, unlike Judaism, Christianity came along and did not provide a political system. It didn't say this is how you run a community and here's how you run a government. It said, here's a way of life of relating directly to God through this intermediary of Jesus, and we together as his people love one another across all racial, ethnic, social, gender barriers and become this new community. And that's something that was easy to translate into all kinds of different settings and cultural frameworks. In some cases, it came into a culture and the culture overwhelmed it and hijacked it for its own purposes, as happened in the Roman Empire and various European empires throughout the centuries, and abused it terribly. But interestingly, the leaven was still there to self-correct it, to judge its own failures, to not live up to the standard of Jesus. My own tradition here in the United States, we had race-based chattel slavery, which is horrific, evil, and yet it was the teachings of Jesus himself that came along to remind us of that evil, to correct it. So I think that's part of the endurance, and you can attribute that entirely to human agency and natural causes and social issues, or you can see a supernatural power at work in that. And I leave that to others to judge for themselves. Obviously, I fall on one side of that. Julian would probably be on the other. But I think that's a lot of the brilliance of what Jesus did and what his followers were able to enact.
Well, thank you very much. I've just really enjoyed this conversation. One final question for you, Julian, which was one of the things that just jarred with me in the book is that you choose the King James version throughout, and you say it's the most poetic version, and yeah, you've got a point there. But I always feel like it's sort of, you feel like Jesus is held at arm's length because it sounds archaic and it makes Jesus sound old-fashioned almost. And that's the thing that for me is like, I always prefer a more modern version than that. What's your reason for going for the King James though? Well,
okay, before I do that, I can't resist saying I've been wanting to say this for ages. Over Skye's shoulder there, he has a Banksy
He does.
Yeah.
He does,
I was speaking to you from Bristol, which is where Banksy is from, of course, and that's a lovely little stencil there of someone who's like, it's a Molotov cocktail, but it's not. It's flowers. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and a wonderful Christian message. That the piece, the kind of pacifism there. Yes, I mean, look, I know what you mean about that. In terms of the more modern translations, they vary. I did like the poetry of it, that is ultimately why I did it. But I tried to take care of that. I tried to check against other translations for meaning. So I didn't want to kind of give an interpretation, because the King James isn't necessarily the most accurate translation, of course. I wanted to make sure that if I was giving the interpretation, it wasn't based on one of the idiosyncrasies of the King James Bible. In terms of the distance, the aloofness, I must admit, I'm not sure. I have read in the past more modern versions. I think, in a sense, though, Jesus is a somewhat distant figure. I think he's a difficult figure. He doesn't come over as your mate, as someone you'd have a drink with in a pub. I know he does socialise with people a lot and everything, but he's so uncompromising. He's quite austere. So in that sense, I don't mind the fact that the Jesus in the King James version comes across slightly distant.
A bit otherworldly.
Slightly otherworldly, yeah.
Well, maybe if you were a Christian, you'd be one of these ones who go back to the Latin or the Greek.
Oh, I don't know about that, because non-parlibus Latinus, whatever you use.
Well, as I say, it's been such an interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I'll make sure there are links to the books that we've been talking about across the course of the programme. But for now, Skye and Julian, thank you very much for being my guests on today's show.
Thank you. And thank you, Skye. Great conversation.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.